So we're turning to tonight's speaker. It's wonderful to welcome Professor Dinah Birch, Emeritus Professor of English and formerly Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Public Engagement at the University of Liverpool. And Dinah, as I'm sure everybody knows, is a very respected Victorianist. She's published widely in 19th century literature and has a special interest in Ruskin, who is the subject, I believe, of her first book, Ruskin's Myths. I think that was your first book, Dinah. She writes for the Times Literary Supplement and the London Review of Books and contributes to documentaries on Sky Arts. And she's bringing out a book with Oxford University Press at the end of this month on Anthony Trollope. So we're really delighted that we've got Trollopians as well as Ruskinians in the audience. So Dinah's paper today is simply entitled Tennyson and Ruskin. So over to you, Dinah.
Thank you, Valerie. Can everyone hear me? I hope so. Good. It's a real pleasure and an honour to speak to you all tonight, particularly in that there are people here not only from your own society, but also the Ruskin Society and the Trollope Society. I think the word that you used, Valerie, was an ecumenical gathering, and that's what it is. So when Valerie invited me to give this lecture, I really jumped at the chance to do it. Valerie will confirm I didn't need any persuasion. And the reason for that is that it has given me an opportunity to think about two writers who have meant a great deal to me over many years, John Ruskin and Alfred Tennyson. I've been reading Ruskin and Tennyson for, well, I'll just say that I was a teenager when I first encountered their work. But I've never previously given much thought to the relation between them in terms of their personal association, but also the relation between their values, what they represented within the different forms of literary and intellectual culture that shaped them, the culture that they in their turn shaped, and the diverse legacies that they created. And it's something of that relation that I'm going to try to trace with you this evening. I'm going to share my screen, or at least I hope I am. There we go. Okay, is that visible to all? Good, excellent. So I'll continue then. So there they are, our heroes. They were not quite of the same generation. Ruskin was born in 1819. Tennyson was 10 years older. That's not a huge gap, but it's one that made a significant difference. For it meant that Tennyson first began to think of himself as a writer, or more specifically, as a poet, for he never thought of himself as any other kind of writer when British Romanticism was still in full flood. Both Tennyson and Ruskin were precocious, began to publish in their teens. But when Ruskin's work started to appear, the model of romanticism within British culture had begun to shift, modified by the political and social movements that were beginning to make themselves felt as the young Victoria, born in the same year as Ruskin, came to the throne. Ruskin habitually thought of Tennyson at the latter end of the broad category of the younger romantic poets. That's where Ruskin placed Tennyson. Keats, Shelley, Byron. It was an enduring feature of his understanding of Tennyson's writing. It's easy to assume that the most radical difference between the two men was that Tennyson was a poet while Ruskin produced prose. And this is, of course, true, but it is only partly true. In fact, Ruskin was a prolific poet in his early years. His first publications took the form of poems, and he wrote copious quantities of poetry throughout his youth. He won the Newdigate Prize for Poetry as a 20-year-old undergraduate at the University of Oxford in 1839, and he recited his prize-winning entry at a public ceremony in the presence of William Wordsworth, a fact which greatly pleased him. And you see on, I hope, the left of your screen, Ruskin's poem in printed form, Salsette and Elephanta, a prize poem recited in the theatre, Oxford, June the 12th, 1839, by John Ruskin. That was a proud moment for his family. It is, I have to say, a rather ponderous production with a heavily religious theme, which was indeed prescribed by those setting the terms of the prize. And that was the high point of his career as a university student, just about the only high point, as it happens, for Ruskin, like Tennyson, was not a shining academic success as an undergraduate. But that achievement was roughly comparable with Tennyson's winning the Chancellor's Gold Medal for Poetry in Cambridge 10 years earlier, in 1829. Ruskin continued to write poetry until his early 20s, and it was only after the appearance of the first volume of Modern Painters in 1843, a book which quickly became a resounding success, only then did he finally relinquish his aspirations as a poet. A privately printed volume of his verse appeared in 1850, funded by his father. You see it on the right-hand side of your screen. But by 1850, Ruskin's days as a poet were long behind him. And the nature of Ruskin's writing as a teenager and as a young man makes the wisdom of his turning away from poetry very clear. His prose was, from the first, fresh, original, and challenging, and remarkably wide-ranging in its geological, artistic, and architectural subject matter. But his poetry, although never less than fluent and competent, his poetry was derivative, largely reflecting the Scottish tastes of his parents, particularly the tastes of his father, who was hugely ambitious for his talented son. Ruskin wrote poetry because that's what was expected of him, drawing on Byron and Scott as his primary models. And poetry was the genre, broadly speaking, that carried the highest social and cultural status in the early 19th century, certainly higher than art criticism, which really hardly existed in any developed form when Ruskin began to write. Ruskin's later comments on the poetry he wrote as a 16-year-old on a continental tour in 1835 are telling, and here they are. I determined, says Ruskin, I determined that the events and sentiments of this journey should be described in a poetic diary in the style of Don Juan, artfully combined with that of Childe Harold. 2 cantos of this task were indeed finished, carrying me across France to Chamonix, where I broke down, finding that I had exhausted on the Jura all the descriptive terms at my disposal, and that none were left for the Alps. And that wry tone is very characteristic of the way in which Ruskin came to feel about his early poetic efforts. The drawing that you see on your screen dates from that same tour, 1835. So again, Ruskin, a young man, 16 when he completed that. And it is a view of Calais. And I think it shows how even at these very early stages, Ruskin's skills as a draftsman were beginning to develop. Now, Tennyson's response to his romantic models was, of course, of a very different nature. Bold, innovative, inventive. What drove Ruskin to write poetry had more to do with his father's deeply held desire that his son should become a more respectable but equally successful version of Byron than Ruskin's own creative nature. Ruskin's vocation would be developed in different ways, through prose, through his accomplished and again innovative drawing and painting. And he came to realize that his own poetic writing would never be anything more than mediocre. The central reason for Ruskin's abandoning of his early poetic ambitions had to do with his understanding of what Romanticism meant. Wordsworth was the elder statesman of British poetry, and Ruskin prefaced each of the 5 volumes of Modern Painters with an extract from the Excursion. Accuse me not of arrogance if, having walked with nature and offered far as frailty would allow, my heart a daily sacrifice to truth, I now affirm of nature and of truth whom I have served, that their divinity revolts, offended at the ways of men, swayed by such motives to such ends employed, philosophers who, though the human soul be of 1,000 faculties composed, and twice 10,000 interests, do yet prize this soul and the transcendent universe no more than as a mirror that reflects to proud self-love her own intelligence. Those are very Ruskinian sentiments, and versions of them will recur as I discuss Ruskin's motives in this lecture. Nature, truth, nature and truth, divinity, capitalized in this passage. So it's a very Ruskin felt, and he was very consistent in his insistence that epigraph should appear in all editions of Modern Painters, that it was the right epigraph for what he wanted to say. But the young Ruskin had no wish to adopt the grave and stately voice of the elderly Wordsworth. His own largely imitative poetry rested on the assumption that poetry would represent an escape from the responsibilities of everyday life and from the obligations of religious devotion. It would be Byronic, not Wordsworthian, or as close to Byron as he could manage. It was an escape that had its appeal, but it didn't wear well because it came to seem a betrayal of what Ruskin believed to be his proper work. John James Ruskin, Ruskin's father, focused his hopes for his son on art and literature. But Margaret Ruskin, his mother, had different ambitions for her son. She was a deeply committed evangelical Christian, and she hoped and expected that her son would become a clergyman. Ruskin was mostly home educated, with his mother as chief tutor in his early years, and she gave him a schooling that was relentlessly focused on his religious development. Ruskin was, in his later years, to lose the fervent evangelical faith that he'd absorbed from his mother as a child. But he never lost that sense of serious duty that Margaret Ruskin had instilled in him, and the consequent sense that if he was not to be a preacher after all, he would at least be a teacher, though he would not teach the doctrines of the Anglican Church or any other formally constituted church. And he didn't want to teach on a Wordsworthian model, not least because he looked at nature in a different way. This is a quotation from Praeterita, Ruskin's autobiography, written towards the end of his life. A snowdrop, says Ruskin, you see, it's very timely as a quote, that snowdrops are out as I speak. A snowdrop was, to me, as to Wordsworth, part of the Sermon on the Mount, but I never should have written sonnets to the celandine, because it is of a coarse yellow and imperfect form. Ruskin was not always right in this matter. He seems to me to have been wrong. The celandine stands comparison with the snowdrop, but and this is a throwaway semi-jocular remark made towards the end of his life, but it does reveal something about Ruskin's confidence, if you like, in making those judgments, an aesthetic basis, but always nevertheless with an underlying sense of the moral fundamentals of his approach to nature. The snowdrop part of the Sermon on the Mount, but the celandine doesn't quite make it a coarse yellow and an imperfect form. Ruskin's focus on the natural world, and it was a focus not in an allegorical or emblematic sense, it really was a visual focus. His focus on the natural world was one of the ways in which he did not depart from Romanticism. Among the enduring rewards of reading modern painters, and a central reason for its early popularity, lies in its unforgettably vivid and precise depictions of natural phenomena. Charlotte Bronte spoke for many when she said, "I feel now as if I had been walking blindfold. This book seems to give me eyes." But description was not in itself the point. Readers must find their own interpretation of what they see, departing, if necessary, from the orthodoxies of their generation, rather than accepting the values of an established hierarchy of authority. Throughout his life, Ruskin distrusted the exercise of any kind of cultural, political, or ecclesiastical authority. And his fierce commitment to the necessity of independent judgment is central to his distinctive fusion of Romanticism and evangelicalism. His interpretation of the pictures of J.M.W. Turner, the bedrock of his celebration of contemporary landscape art in modern painters, scorns the lofty prestige of the old masters with what Ruskin believes to be their stale and conventional representation of skies and trees and water. Ruskin's art, and Turner's art was celebrated on the basis of its individual and precisely observed truth to nature, that word truth, which Ruskin interpreted as an authentic reflection of a divinely ordained harmony. This was a claim that had more to do with Ruskin than Turner, but that's another story. The point is that Ruskin identified himself as a romantic rebel, but a rebel whose underlying values were both aesthetic and deeply moral. Tennyson was also an independently minded iconoclast, but the rebellion represented in his early work was of a very different kind. Arthur Hallam's ardent essay of 1831, published in the Englishman's Magazine as a response to Tennyson's 1830 volume of poetry, is of course an essential starting point for anyone wanting to understand the origins of Tennyson's work. As a recent lecture in this series from Naomi Levine made eloquently clear. The title of Hallam's celebrated essay is telling on some of the characteristics of modern poetry and on the lyrical poems of Alfred Tennyson. Like Ruskin in Modern Painters, Hallam is talking about something new, something modern, in fact. But Hallam, whose influence on Tennyson was both profound and enduring, had a very different vision of the modern than anything encountered by the readers of Modern Painters. There's Hallam looking serious, perhaps not the most graceful picture, but nevertheless reading as he and his colleagues did a great deal. They were a very literary circle. I quote from Hallam's essay then. Whenever the mind of the artist suffers itself to be occupied during its periods of creation by any other predominant motive than the desire of beauty, the result is false in art. Ruskin is often seen as the great prophet of beauty, but the desire of beauty was never, for him, the central purpose of art. It was always subservient to the desire for truth and the desire for justice. But Hallam is uncompromising in his rejection of anything other than an aesthetic purpose for poetry. For a man whose reveries take a reasoning turn and who is accustomed to measure his ideas by their logical relations rather than the congruity of the sentiments to which they refer, will be apt to mistake the pleasure in knowing a thing to be true for the pleasure he would have in knowing it to be beautiful, and so will pile his thoughts in a rhetorical battery that they may convince instead of letting them flow in a natural course of contemplation, that they may enrapture. And Hallam continues in comparably confident vein, praising those he terms the poets of sensation, including Tennyson, rather than reflection, like Wordsworth. Other poets, he says, other poets seek for images to illustrate their conceptions. These men had no need to seek. They lived in a world of image, for the most important and extensive portion of their life consisted in those emotions which were immediately conversant with sensation. Now, Hallam was very young when he wrote that, only 20 years old. Remarkable, really, given the range and assurance of his essay. And he was talking about other young men, Shelley, Keats, and of course Tennyson. But Keats and Shelley had died, and Hallam had just 2 years left to live. Wordsworth, the sober poet of reflection, whose values Hallam, like Ruskin, wanted to leave behind, was 61, had 19 years left to live. And Tennyson would live for another 61 years. I hope my arithmetic is correct. Writing poetry to the end. Hallam had produced what amounted to a young man's manifesto, ringingly sure of itself, as young men's manifestos often are. Its terms were not of a kind that Tennyson could easily carry through the decades. Tennyson never quite lost the impulse that Hallam had described. The urge to write poetry at one remove from the moral and ethical questions of his generation, answering to different imaginative imperatives. But he was far from being immune to those challenges, nor from the expectation pervasive in the middle decades of the 19th century that a serious writer would engage with the urgent issues arising from a period of rapid social and economic change. When he succeeded Wordsworth as poet laureate in 1850 and became to some extent the poetic voice of the nation, this tension grew still stronger. But it had been there long before he assumed that public role. The need and wish to write responsibly, and the conflicting need and wish to separate himself from the demands of public responsibility and write poetry that denied any division between emotion and image. And it was from this tension that some of the deepest and most powerful currents in Tennyson's writing emerge. And it was within these tensions that the division between Tennyson and Ruskin made itself felt. The divergence between Tennyson and Ruskin was at its most apparent in the third volume of Modern Painters, published in 1856. The personal relations between the two writers, both then at the peak of their fame and success, had up to that point been formal, a little distant and wary, but respectful. And in fact, they always were respectful. But in this book, Ruskin defines his differences from Tennyson's poetic vision in terms that must surely have ruled out any future friendship, though there was never any kind of open quarrel between the two. In his much-cited chapter on the pathetic fallacy, Ruskin turns his attention to poetry, particularly in relation to a poet's association with the natural world. In doing so, he makes a distinction between those poets who, in his view, sustain a clear distinction between human emotion and the external realities of the natural world and those who do not or cannot. Poets and dramatists whose images fuse feeling and perception have succumbed, Ruskin claims, to what he terms the pathetic fallacy. Ruskin is not exactly rude about such writers, but he argues that they belong to the second order of poets, while the first rank is occupied by poets such as Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare. And Tennyson, along with Wordsworth and Keats, is placed very firmly in that second division. But Keats and Tennyson and the poets of the second order are generally themselves subdued by the feelings under which they write, or at least write as choosing to be so, and therefore admit certain expressions and modes of thought which are in some sort diseased or false. To illustrate his point, Ruskin quotes from extracts from the newly published Maud. For a great speculation had failed, and ever he muttoned and maddened, and ever wanned with despair, and out he walked when the wind like a broken worldling wailed, and the flying gold of the ruined woodlands drove through the air. And then the second example from Maud. There has fallen a splendid tear from the passion flower at the gate. The red rose cries, she is near, and the white rose weeps, she is late. The larkspur listens, I hear, and the lily whispers, I wait. That image on the right-hand side, I'm sure familiar to you all, is Rossetti's wonderful, I think, sketch of Tennyson reading Maud aloud in 1855. From Tennyson's point of view, it must have been particularly galling that Ruskin had in fact written to him to praise Maud on its first publication, if in heavily qualified and somewhat condescending terms. I do not like its versification so well as some of your other work, not because I do not think it good of its kind, but because I do not think that wild kind quite so good, and I am sorry to have another cloud put in the sky of one's thoughts by the sad story. But as to the general bearing and delicate finish of the thing in its way, I think no admiration can be too extravagant. Sorry, I've dropped the word too there. It doesn't really help that in modern painters, Ruskin describes his examples from Maud as exquisite, as indeed they are. The point, as he sees it, is that they assimilate the natural world into the speaker's unbalanced and highly emotional state of mind. And this, for Ruskin, won't do. The appearance of the pathetic fallacy consigns a poet to an essential inferiority. Ruskin explains that so far as it is a fallacy, it is always the sign of a morbid state of mind and comparatively of a weak one. Even in the most inspired prophet, it is a sign of the incapacity of his human soul, human sight or thought to bear what has been revealed to it. In ordinary poetry, if it is found in the thoughts of the poet himself, it is at once a sign of his belonging to the inferior school. If, in the thoughts of the characters imagined by him, it is right or wrong according to the genuineness of the emotion from which it springs, always, however, implying necessarily some degree of weakness in the character. The grounds of Ruskin's argument are consistent with his position throughout modern painters. The pathetic fallacy, as he understands it, is a sign of weakness because it is a denial of truth, always the watchword of Ruskin's position. He concludes his chapter on the pathetic fallacy in characteristically didactic terms. It then being, I hope, now made clear to the reader in all respects that the pathetic fallacy is powerful only so far as it is pathetic, feeble so far as it is fallacious, and therefore that the dominion of truth is entire over this as over every other natural and just state of the human mind. So Ruskin's objections to Tennyson's position rests on his sense that art, whether it is the work of a painter or a poet, must defer to the clear-eyed perception of the natural world and the moral order it represents that he thought essential to all expressions of truth, and that such perception was inextricably linked with the engagement with political and social questions that increasingly absorbed his energy as he grew older. As Valerie points out in her very helpful 2019 article on Tennyson in Ruskin in the Bulletin, the third volume of Modern Painters summarizes his view. The greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion all in one. Well, I've always felt under these circumstances that it is a tribute to Tennyson's forbearance and tolerance that he wasn't crosser with Ruskin, though he must surely have felt quite cross. He said little in reply to Ruskin's observations, or indeed little of which we have a record. What he said to Emily over the breakfast table must remain unknown. But when Ruskin singled out the image of Maud's feet leaving the daisies rosy in his 1865 Sesame and Lilies, Tennyson mentioned to Thomas Wilson that, I quote, "The very day I wrote it, I saw the daisies rosy in Maiden's Croft and thought of enclosing one to Ruskin labelled a pathetic fallacy." A moment of irritation on Tennyson's part. But in fact, in Sesame and Lilies, Ruskin was praising that image for the precision of its delicate observation, its truth. What Ruskin might well have resented was Ruskin's appropriation of Maud in Sesame and Lilies for his own purposes of moral and personal exaltation. Sesame and Lilies was written when Ruskin had turned from the criticism of art and poetry to political and social activism. In the essay entitled Of Queen's Gardens, He addresses women specifically, although still more specifically, he is speaking to one young woman, Rose Latouche, the girl he loved with a passionate obsession. In a vain attempt to persuade her to set aside her fanatically introspective piety in order to go out into the world and work on behalf of others. He urges his female readers to translate their love of flowers into practical action, addressing the pitiful plight, for instance, of urban prostitutes, feeble florets, as he calls them. And he does so by drawing out a Christian resonance in Tennyson's lyric, the same lyric that he'd used to illustrate the pathetic fallacy in modern painters. But here it figures very differently in his argument. Come into the garden, Maud, for the black bat, night, has flown. Come into the garden, Maud, I am here at the gate alone. Who is it, think you, who stands at the gate of this sweeter garden alone, waiting for you? Did you ever hear, not of a Maud, but a Madeline, who went down to her garden in the dawn and found one waiting at the gate, whom she supposed to be the gardener? This aggressively preacherly analogy was hardly what Tennyson had intended in Maud. His vision was of a different kind. Writing about the Idylls of the King in 1859, is beginning to appear, Ruskin complained that Tennyson's powers ought not to be spent on visions of things past, but on the living present. But for Tennyson, the past was a living reality, the past of personal memory and of myth and legend, but also the past as it was embodied in the writing of the great community of poets and dramatists who fueled and supported Tennyson's imagination. It's a commonplace for critics and scholars of Tennyson's poetry to comment on the intensely referential nature of his work, and to note that this is much more than a matter of quoting great writing in order to claim a high standing for his own poetry, nor is it entirely akin to the methods of, say, T.S. Eliot, whose multiple allusions and references in The Wasteland, comparable works, have to do with a wish to signal fragmentation and loss, while Tennyson's are more usually a way of expressing forms of connection, though Eliot and Tennyson do, in fact, I would argue, have rather more in common than might be supposed. Tennyson brings the past and the present together within a resonant poetic whole, partly as a means of extending the range of the deeply personal elegiac impulse of his poetry into a body of work that could reach beyond Tennyson's own pervasive sense of mortality. The opening lines of Maud reflect this impulse, remembering the loss of a father and recalling the myth of Narcissus and Echo. And Echo there, whatever is asked her, answers death. But the poem moves towards a refutation of that claustrophobic echo, and despite Ruskin's feeling that Tennyson doesn't engage with the living present, it does so partly through its condemnation of contemporary corruption, financial greed, adulterated food, violence. The protagonist thinks of escaping his misery, and from his first troubling thoughts of Maud, in a narcissic impulse to turn inward. I will bury myself in myself. But the first version of that line, changed in 1865, was interestingly different. I will bury myself in my books. This is a poem that has as much to do with the larger world of literature and myth as with the self or with social protest, though here, as throughout the poem, its references are shadowed by a preoccupation with death and burial. Maud's final resolution turns on the hero's embrace of the supposedly noble cause of the Crimean War, a choice signalled by a passage that illustrates perfectly what Ruskin had pointed to as the pathetic fallacy at its most telling. The vision of the dead Maud appears in a dream in which the natural world is suffused by the protagonist's own approaching death. It fell at a time of year when the face of night is fair on the dewy downs, and the shining daffodil dies, and the charioteer and starry Gemini hang like glorious crowns over Orion's grave, low down in the west. That like a silent lightning under the stars, she seemed to divide in a dream from a band of the blessed, and spoke of a hope for the world in the coming wars. And in that hope, dear soul, let trouble have rest, knowing I tarry for thee, and pointed to Mars as he glowed like a ruddy shield on the lion's breast. It's in the context of war and a poet's duty to respond to war that Ruskin's difference from Tennyson is at its most acute. In 1859, as Tennyson's idylls began to appear, Ruskin wrote to Tennyson. He'd been travelling in Europe and was deeply dismayed by the events of the Austro-Sardinian War and by what he felt was Britain's shabby conduct in relation to the conflict. Ruskin argues that in the facts of modern life, there remains an infinity of what men should be told and what none but a poet can tell. It continues, this seems to me the true task of the modern poet. And I think I have seen faces and heard voices by road and street side which claimed or confirmed as much as ever the loveliest or saddest of Camelot. As I watch them, the feeling continually weighs upon me, day by day, more and more, that not the grief of the world, but the loss of it is the wonder of it. I see creatures so full of all power and beauty, with none to understand or teach or save them. The making in them of miracles, and all cast away, forever lost as far as we can trace, and no in memoriam. In an article for the Tennyson Research Bulletin published in 2020, Michael Sullivan's here tonight, highlights the immediately following lines of this letter, redacted by Hallam Tennyson in the text as it was published in the memoir. I've been terribly depressed, Ruskin says. I've been terribly depressed on this journey, first by the dastardly conduct of England in this Italian war, then by the less cowardly but equally base and selfish interference. These lines make clear Ruskin's urgent and often painful sense that writers, including and perhaps especially poets, had a responsibility to intervene in public debate no matter how controversial their views might be. Feeling as he did that the legendary Camelot of the Idylls represented a withdrawal from engagement with contemporary affairs, the distance between Ruskin and Tennyson widened. The two men had taken different paths. Where did this difference come from? Its deepest sources lay in the experiences of their early years. Both writers were rooted in the literary and poetic culture of Romanticism, but Ruskin's romantic identity was tempered by the consequences of his evangelical education, which had led to a lasting sense of inescapable moral responsibility. And that education also lay at the heart of his interpretation of what writing should be in formal terms. The evangelical churches and nonconformist chapels that Ruskin attended until middle age, when his Christian faith faltered, held the sermon rather than any sacred liturgy at the heart of their religious practice. And the model of a secular sermon preached on the basis of a series of initiating texts that were no longer exclusively biblical, but included natural phenomena like clouds or trees or stones, or human artifacts like buildings or pictures, became the basis of Ruskin's personal, direct, and often exhortatory writing. But Tennyson was the son of an Anglican clergyman. Despite the persistent difficulties surrounding his early family life, he never lost his sense of a body of sanctified writing, primarily represented in the Anglican Church by the Book of Common Prayer, but which in Tennyson's poetic practice came to include the resonant body of interconnected literary texts that he revered. Tennyson was certainly interested in religion, but he was not a religious poet. But he did not lose that imaginative sense of the circling liturgical year that underpinned Anglican religious experience, with the revolving cycle of festivals and saints' days which marks the turning seasons. That primary rhythm of the revolving circle, or of the return of the mind upon itself, as Hallam had put it, is fundamental to In Memoriam. You see it in the stanzaic form and in the governing analogy with the great circles of Dante's Divine Comedy. But it's a defining characteristic of all Tennyson's writing, built on resonance and recurrence, from the early lyrics through to his retelling of the legends of the Round Table. Tennyson is the great poet of the return. The fact that both Tennyson and Ruskin were, in their later years at least, bearded sages with enormous prestige of a kind that extended beyond their deaths has made it easy to overestimate their similarities. And of course, there are many points of comparison. They were both deeply serious writers. Both believed that their work mattered, though in very different ways. Both changed the form of the literary cultures in which they worked. Both wrote in ways that were rooted in the past, developing their own forms of elegiac voices. But in terms of their values and of their legacies, they were radically different in ways that helped to define the ongoing presence of Victorian culture in the 20th century and beyond. Ruskin became a major influence on political and cultural affairs nationally and internationally, shaping, for instance, the earliest years of the British Labour Party leaving his mark on the thinking of Mahatma Gandhi, inspiring the creation of the National Trust, initiating the movement to conserve old buildings rather than to restore and rebuild them. His active following among women and among working class readers meant that he shaped the ambitions of many who'd been excluded from traditional channels of education and influence. Tennyson's pervasive influence was chiefly literary, forming as it did generations of poets and artists who, in diverse ways, emulated his distinctive fusion of personal memory with the larger cultural legacies of the past, and enabling the development of forms that bridge the persistence of Romanticism and the high seriousness of the Victorians with the new energies of modernism. The history of poetry in English was shaped and changed by Tennyson's work. Ruskin and Tennyson emerged from different worlds, and neither ever fully understood the other. But we, their inheritors, have every reason to celebrate both. Thank you.